Recently, I've written a couple of articles about the idea of running Hyper-V virtual machines on a RAM disk as a way of improving overall performance. So in this video, I wanted to explore the idea a little bit more. I wanted to show you first and foremost how to create a RAM disk and then how to create a virtual machine that's hosted on that RAM disk. But at the same time, I also wanted to show you what types of performance gains you could realistically expect. So my plan for this video is to benchmark the entire process. We're going to install several different virtual machines. I'm going to begin by creating a Windows 10 virtual machine on a spinning disk, an HDD or hard disk drive. And I'm going to start a timer that's going to begin when I power on the virtual machine, and then I'll stop the timer once we get to the Windows desktop so that we can find out how long it took to create that virtual machine. Then the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the process, only the second time around I'm going to create the virtual machine on NVMe storage, so that way we can get a feel for the difference that having solid state storage makes as opposed to creating a virtual machine on a spinning hard disk. So then from there, I'm going to create a RAM disk, and I'm going to repeat the process, only this time I'm going to create the virtual machine on the RAM disk instead of creating it on solid state storage or on a hard disk drive. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to repeat the process where I create a virtual machine on a RAM disk. But the one thing that I'm going to do different is I'm also going to copy the installation media to a RAM disk. So we're going to be installing Windows 4 separate times in 4 separate ways, and then comparing the time difference between the various methods. So that's my plan for this video. Now before I get started, I just want to clarify that yes, I'm going to be creating Windows 10 virtual machines as opposed to Windows 11. And the only reason that I'm doing that is just because Windows 10 is a little bit quicker and easier to install, and I'm not doing unintended installations here. So I'm going for simplicity. And incidentally, because I'm not doing unattended installations, this process isn't entirely scientific because part of the time difference is going to depend on my reaction time. Even so, I'm going to do my best to install each virtual machine as quickly as I possibly can using the various methods. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. So as you can see, I've got a timer in the upper left corner of the screen, and I'll start this timer when I power on the virtual machine. But first we need to create the virtual machine. So I've got the Hyper-V Manager on screen. I'm going to click New, Virtual Machine. I'll click Next. I'm just going to call this virtual machine VM. And I'm going to place the virtual machine on a spinning disk. I'll click Next. I'll make this a Generation 2 virtual machine. I'll click Next, and I'm going to give the virtual machine 4 gigabytes of memory. So I'll type 4096. I'll click Next. I'm not going to worry about attaching this to the network. I'll click Next. I'm going to create a 20 gigabyte virtual disk. And then I'll click Next. And I'll select the installation media. And I'll click Next. And everything looks good here, so I'll click Finish to create the virtual machine. And I'll go ahead and open up the virtual machine console. And I'll start the virtual machine, start the timer, and install Windows as fast as I possibly can. Okay, so it looks like the process has completed, and it took about 25 minutes and 40 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and blow out this virtual machine. And then I'm going to create another virtual machine using NVMe storage. Okay, so let's reset the timer. And I'm going to create a virtual machine in exactly the same way as I did a moment ago. So I'll go to New, Virtual Machine. I'll click Next. I'll call the virtual machine VM. And I'll store the virtual machine on NVMe storage. I'll click Next. I'll make this a Generation 2 virtual machine. Once again, I'm going to assign 4 gigabytes of memory. I'll click Next. I'm not going to worry about network connectivity. Once again, I'll create a 20 gigabyte virtual hard disk. I'll click Next. I'll use the same installation media as before. I'll click Next and Finish. So the virtual machine has been created. I'll click Start and then I'll start the timer. And so the process has completed, and it took about 6 minutes and 43 seconds. So again, that was installing to NVMe storage. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead and reset everything. And next we'll install to a RAM disk. Now Windows doesn't contain any built-in tools for setting up a RAM disk, so I'm using a free tool that I got from the internet called IMDisk. And you can see that I've got the RAM disk configuration utility on screen right now. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. And here's what the utility looks like. We need to specify the size of the RAM disk that we're creating. Right now it's set to 30 gigabytes. I'll go ahead and go with that. The next thing that we have to do is assign a drive letter. It's going to use the R disk, so that's fine. I'll go ahead and use that. I'll set the file system to NTFS. And I'm not going to worry about launching this at Windows Startup or creating a temp folder. I'm just going to go ahead and click OK and click Close. And you can see a message saying that the new RAM disk is being mounted. So it's very, very easy to set up a RAM disk. And if you look at File Explorer, you can see our newly created RAM disk right here. And right now it is empty. So I'm going to go ahead and close out File Explorer. And I'm going to minimize the RAM disk settings. And let's create a virtual machine on the RAM disk. I'll do this in exactly the same way as I did before. I'll go to New Virtual Machine. Next, I'll call the virtual machine VM. I'll store the virtual machine on my RAM disk, so I'll make this the R drive. And let's go ahead and create the VMs folder just in case. I'll click Next. We'll make it a Generation 2 virtual machine. I'll click Next. I'll assign 4 gigabytes of memory. I'll click Next. We won't worry about networking. I'll create a 20 gigabyte virtual hard disk. And we'll use the same installation media as before. I'll click Next and then Finish. And once again, I'll click Start, and then I'll start the timer. And the installation is completed, and we did it in 6 minutes and 1 second. So that's the amount of time that it took to install Windows to a RAM disk. So now I'm going to restart the timer, and I'm going to go ahead and blow out this virtual machine. And I'm going to perform one more installation, but I'm going to do things a little bit differently. This time I'm going to install Windows to a RAM disk, but before I do, I'm also going to copy the installation media to a RAM disk. Okay, so here I am in File Explorer, and I'm going to copy my installation media. And I'll copy this to the RAM disk. And while this is copying, I'm going to go into my VMs folder just to show you that there's nothing there. I've gone ahead and blown out the previous virtual machine. Okay, so the Windows installation media has copied. So let's go ahead and close this out and deploy Windows one more time. So I'm going to click New, Virtual Machine. I'll click Next. Again, I'll call the virtual machine VM. And I'm going to deploy this to my RAM disk. So I'll place it on the R drive in the VMs folder and click Next. I'll set this to a Generation 2 virtual machine. I'm going to assign 4 GB of memory. I'll click Next. I'm not going to worry about networking. I'll click Next. And I'll create a 20 GB virtual hard disk. I'll click Next. And then on the installation options screen, I'm going to install the operating system from a bootable image file. But rather than using the ISO file that's stored on the C drive, I'm going to go to the R drive, or my RAM disk. I'm going to select the image file and click Open. So we're using the image file on the RAM disk. I'll click Next and then Finish. And the virtual machine is created. So once again, I'll click Start and then I'll start the timer and we'll see how long it takes to install Windows. And the process is complete, and it looks like it took 5 minutes and 41 seconds to complete the installation. So just to reiterate, when we installed Windows to a spinning disk, it took about 25 minutes and 40 seconds. That time was decreased to 6 minutes and 43 seconds when we installed Windows to NVMe storage. When we installed Windows to a RAM disk, the time dropped again, all the way down to 6 minutes. And then finally, when we copied the installation media to a RAM disk and installed Windows to a RAM disk, the time dropped again to 5 minutes and 41 seconds. Now, admittedly, this is non-scientific because the results depend on my reaction time, and it's also hardware specific. If you ran this test on your system, you'd probably get different numbers. Even so, I think the numbers are representational of what you can realistically expect. So what does this translate to in terms of percentages? Well, some rough numbers off the top of my head are that when we installed to a RAM disk using RAM disk mounted installation media, we saw roughly about a 460% improvement over the time that it took to install to a spinning disk. And we also saw about a 15% improvement over installing Windows to NVMe storage. So clearly, using a RAM disk does translate to improvements in performance. Now, of course, those improvements come with some risk because if the machine were to be accidentally turned off, then the RAM disk contents are cleared, and at that point, you would have to start over. So that's just a quick demo of how you might set up a RAM disk, how to mount a Hyper-V virtual machine on a RAM disk, and what types of performance improvements you might expect in various conditions.